Richard Miller parked his luxury sedan inside the expansive garage of his Winnetka estate and turned off the engine. But he did not step out immediately. He sat there in the quiet interior, resting his heavy hands on the steering wheel, taking a deep and trembling breath. This new woman was the 11th caregiver they had hired in the span of 6 short months. 11th. He no longer knew what to say, what promises to make, or what miracles to expect. His mother, the formidable Frances Miller, had thoroughly rejected all 10 of the previous candidates. Every single one had been dismissed for a completely different reason, yet always with the exact same unyielding firmness that she possessed. Richard was utterly exhausted, not in a physical sense, because he could easily endure 16 hours of grueling work at his Chicago corporate headquarters without blinking an eye. Emotionally, however, he was standing at the absolute edge of his limits, watching his beloved mother wither away, stubbornly refusing any professional help, and isolating herself deeper within her own mind, hurt him far more than any catastrophic financial loss. When he left the house that morning, right after introducing the newest applicant, he had thought with a heavy dose of bitterness that he would handle some corporate mergers and then return home only to sign yet another termination check. He had absolutely zero hope left in his weary heart. The morning interview with the young woman had been brief, following the usual strict protocols of the affluent household. The young lady appeared highly competent, boasted excellent references from previous employers, spoke in a remarkably soft tone, and was impeccably polite. However, Richard had already seen 10 identical profiles, and absolutely none of them had managed to survive his mother's intense scrutiny. So he simply left for his downtown office, diving headfirst into endless board meetings, reviewing massive contracts, and making swift decisions that involved millions of dollars. Yet, his mind remained firmly anchored back at the suburban estate. No matter how much he tried to concentrate on building his empire, none of it mattered if he could not save his own mother. Frances Miller was by no means an easy woman to deal with, and Richard had known this fact for his entire life. She was a woman of incredible substance, maintaining an impeccable posture, always choosing her words with extreme caution, and living as a grieving widow for the past 3 years. She had never allowed herself to show weakness in public, never shed a single tear in front of anyone, and never complained about her difficult circumstances. But Richard saw straight through her tough exterior. He clearly saw the profound loneliness, the bone-deep fatigue, and the immense longing for the husband who had departed from this world far too soon. He noticed the subtle moments when she would stare endlessly at the large oil portrait of his father in the grand living room, entirely lost in a suffocating silence. He noticed when she began turning down invitations to high society galas, when she actively avoided meaningful conversations, and when she pretended everything was perfectly fine, while it clearly was not. High blood pressure, concerning heart palpitations, and frequent moments of severe forgetfulness became her new, terrifying reality. The prestigious family doctor had been incredibly clear with his medical instructions. She desperately needed someone by her side, someone to monitor her health, keep her company, and be a constant presence. Richard had genuinely tried his absolute best to fulfill the doctor's strict orders, but he simply could not be at the estate 24 hours a day. The massive corporation demanded his undivided attention, and he was only one mortal man. So, he resorted to hiring the best professional caregivers money could buy in the city. The first candidate seemed entirely perfect on her pristine resume, possessing an advanced nursing degree and 10 years of solid experience. She lasted exactly 3 days before Frances declared her entirely too cold and robotic. The second woman was exceptionally warm and constantly smiling, trying relentlessly to spark up joyful conversations. She lasted a single week before Frances deemed her terribly invasive and disrespectful of the household's need for quiet contemplation. The third caregiver was incredibly discreet, moving around the large house almost like an invisible entity, trying her best not to disturb anyone. She lasted a mere 2 days, because Frances fiercely claimed the woman was practically a ghost, who completely destroyed her fragile nerves. And so the agonizing cycle continued. One woman after another, young and old, highly experienced and eager beginners, but absolutely none of them were deemed acceptable. Richard tried desperately to reason with her, attempting to discover exactly what kind of personality his mother actually desired, but Frances offered zero explanations. She would merely state, in that authoritative tone that permitted absolutely no arguments, that the woman was inadequate and could be sent away immediately. Richard was forced to comply, paying their severance, offering his deepest apologies, and starting the exhausting process all over again. By the time the 10th caregiver was sent packing, Richard had become entirely cynical about the whole grueling ordeal. When his executive assistant called about yet another potential candidate, he had almost declined, completely ready to surrender to the inevitable failure. But some small, stubborn spark of desperation compelled him to agree to just one more final attempt. That was exactly how Madeline Smith walked into their complicated lives. Richard had barely even looked at her properly before rushing off to handle a severe supplier crisis, absolutely convinced that he would be firing her by the time the sun went down. Richard finally managed to untangle himself from the chaotic corporate disputes and began the long drive back to the affluent suburbs. By the time he actually pulled into the long driveway of the Winnetka estate, it was already approaching 6 o'clock in the evening. The golden light of the late afternoon sun filtered beautifully through the massive windows of the grand mansion, painting the luxurious interiors in warm, amber hues. He stepped through the heavy mahogany front door, entirely mentally prepared for the suffocating silence that usually greeted him. He braced himself to find his mother sitting entirely alone in the dim living room, staring blankly at nothing, ready to utter those dreaded words of dismissal once again. Instead of the anticipated heavy silence, a sound echoed down the long marble hallway that made Richard freeze entirely in his tracks. Laughter. Genuine, unmistakable laughter coming directly from his mother. He stood completely immobile, his leather briefcase dangling limply from his grip, trying desperately to process the impossible audio reaching his ears. Frances Miller simply did not laugh. Not like this. Not with such incredible lightness and unburdened spontaneity. She would occasionally offer a polite, tightly controlled smile at social gatherings, but a deep, true laugh was something Richard had not heard echoing in this house for 3 very long years. He began to walk forward slowly, almost terrified that his heavy footsteps would shatter the magical illusion. As he finally reached the large arched doorway of the main living room, he stopped and stared in sheer disbelief. Frances was seated in her usual velvet armchair, but her entire demeanor was drastically transformed. The tight lines of chronic tension on her face had completely relaxed. Her eyes were shining brightly, and she was smiling with absolute sincerity. Standing right beside her, holding a delicate silver hairbrush, was the new young woman, Madeline. She was gently brushing Frances's silver hair with a level of tenderness that Richard had never witnessed from any medical professional. The movements were not rushed or mechanical. They were incredibly gentle, as if every single strand of hair truly mattered to her. The two women were deeply engrossed in a lively, animated conversation. Frances was actually telling a story, gesturing lightly with her hands, while Madeline listened intently, offering soft responses and smiling warmly, which prompted his mother to laugh out loud once again. Richard simply remained hidden in the doorway, quietly observing the miraculous scene unfolding before him, and a profound shift occurred deep within his chest. It was not mere physical attraction, although Madeline was undeniably beautiful, in a very natural, unpretentious manner. It was a profound sense of admiration, and the shocking realization that he was witnessing something incredibly rare and entirely genuine in a world full of artificiality. Madeline was tending to Frances, as if the older woman were her own flesh and blood, not simply because she was collecting a handsome paycheck, but because she genuinely seemed to care about her emotional well-being. And Frances, the impossible matriarch who had fiercely rejected 10 highly qualified women before her, had miraculously accepted this gentle stranger into her personal space. Richard suddenly recalled a piece of wisdom his late father used to repeat quite often. A mother always knows the true nature of a person's soul. He stayed perfectly still, watching as Madeline carefully pinned up his mother's hair, and then he witnessed Francis reach out to gently squeeze the young woman's hand in a silent gesture of profound gratitude. Knowing that he could not hide in the shadows forever, Richard softly cleared his throat to announce his quiet arrival. Both women turned their heads toward the doorway simultaneously. Frances smiled at her son, and it was a remarkably peaceful expression that he had desperately missed. She warmly beckoned him to enter, eagerly stating that she wanted him to be properly introduced to Madeline. The young caregiver turned fully to face him, and their eyes locked for the very first time. She possessed the most honest, clear brown eyes he had ever seen, and when she offered him a somewhat shy yet incredibly authentic smile, Richard found himself temporarily robbed of all his corporate words. He managed a polite greeting, finally stepping completely into the spacious living room with careful, measured steps. Madeline respectfully stepped back slightly, quietly placing the silver hairbrush into her modest tote bag, resting near the velvet sofa. She was wearing a very simple light blue uniform, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her look perfectly at home in the opulent surroundings. Frances enthusiastically tapped the empty space on the plush furniture beside her, instructing her son to sit down and properly acquaint himself with the lovely young woman who had brought such unexpected joy into their dreary afternoon. After a brief, polite exchange of names, Frances proudly announced that Madeline had actually listened to her stories, treating her like a complex human being rather than a fragile medical patient. Richard was utterly astonished by this extremely high praise. Then, Madeline quietly mentioned that it was time to prepare the evening meal, and respectfully asked if Frances preferred to eat in the formal dining room or right there in the cozy living room. When Frances warmly replied that they should eat in the living room and casually called the caregiver dear, Richard nearly choked on his own breath. In less than 12 hours, the impossible had happened, and Richard knew his life was about to change completely. Half an hour later, Madeline returned from the massive gourmet kitchen, carrying a large silver tray laden with steaming vegetable soup, warm crusty bread, and freshly squeezed juice. The meal was incredibly simple, yet it was presented with such meticulous care that it felt like a grand royal feast. As she set the tray down and quietly prepared to retreat to the kitchen, Frances sternly commanded her to stay and join them for dinner. Although Madeline initially tried to politely decline, claiming she had already eaten her own supper, Frances saw right through the polite lie and insisted. Richard quickly added his own gentle encouragement, secretly thrilled at the prospect of spending more time observing this fascinating woman. As the three of them shared the comforting, warm meal, Frances began asking gentle, inquisitive questions about Madeline's personal background. Richard sat quietly, absorbing every single detail, as Madeline explained that she originally hailed from a very small rural farming community in southern Indiana. She had moved to the bustling city of Chicago 2 years ago in search of better economic opportunities. When asked about her family, Madeline's bright eyes dimmed slightly as she shared that her beloved father had passed away when she was just a little girl, leaving her resilient mother, Carol, to raise her all entirely alone in the quiet countryside. Frances immediately offered her deepest sympathies, creating a beautiful moment of shared understanding between two women who knew profound loss. Richard watched in absolute awe as Madeline spoke about her mother with such deep affection and palpable longing. He meticulously observed the way she gave Frances her complete, undivided attention whenever the older woman spoke, never interrupting or looking at the grand antique clock on the wall. He found himself utterly captivated by her simple, unpretentious smile, wondering how on earth this humble young woman had managed to bring so much radiant light into their dark, grieving household, without even seeming to try. By the time the delicious meal was finished, Frances had already commanded Madeline to arrive extra early the next morning, so they could enjoy a proper breakfast together. After Madeline had cleaned the kitchen and prepared to leave for the night, Frances shot her son a very pointed, authoritative look. She strictly forbade Richard from allowing the young woman to take the dangerous public transit buses all the way back to her distant apartment in the city. Richard, knowing perfectly well that arguing with his mother was an entirely futile endeavor, quickly agreed to act as Madeline's personal chauffeur. When he walked into the kitchen and announced his mother's strict decree, Madeline's eyes widened in sheer surprise, and she immediately tried to refuse the generous offer, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a wealthy executive driving her home. Richard firmly but kindly insisted, and soon they were walking together out to the sprawling concrete driveway. He politely opened the passenger door of his sleek luxury car for her, and she slipped inside, looking very small against the plush leather seats. The drive toward downtown Chicago was mostly blanketed in a quiet, slightly nervous silence at first. Richard was completely unaccustomed to sharing space with someone who wanted absolutely nothing from his immense wealth, someone who made zero effort to flatter his massive ego. Eventually, Madeline broke the heavy silence, softly commenting on how incredibly strong and remarkable his mother truly was, despite the profound grief she constantly carried. Richard smiled warmly, agreeing that his mother had always possessed a notoriously stubborn and fierce spirit. He then turned his head slightly, genuinely asking Madeline how she had miraculously managed to break through Francis's impenetrable emotional walls in a single day when 10 highly trained professionals had failed miserably. Madeline looked out the window at the passing city lights and answered with striking, beautiful honesty. She explained that she simply treated Francis the exact way she would want her own aging mother to be treated, with basic human dignity, genuine patience, and complete honesty. She firmly believed that pretending to be perfect was emotionally exhausting, and she vastly preferred to be entirely real. They eventually pulled up in front of an older, modest brick apartment building on the working-class side of the sprawling city. It was a stark visual contrast to the sprawling mansions of Winnetka, but it looked incredibly clean and well-maintained. Before stepping out into the cool night air, Madeline turned to look directly at him, offering a deeply sincere word of thanks for the safe ride and for trusting her with his mother's fragile well-being. Richard looked right back into her beautiful brown eyes and confidently stated that he completely believed in her unique abilities. She offered a final, brilliant smile before disappearing into the old brick building. Over the passing weeks, a breathtaking transformation swept through the grand Winnetka estate. Francis began waking up early, excitedly planning daily activities, and even returned to cooking her famous secret recipes, with Madeline acting as her eager assistant. Richard found himself rushing home from his corporate empire hours earlier than usual, practically inventing ridiculous excuses to be near the two women. His deep admiration for the caregiver quickly blossomed into a profound, undeniable affection. This undeniable truth culminated on a beautiful Saturday afternoon when Francis practically forced Madeline to attend a special weekend family lunch. Seeing her walk through the bright garden in a simple floral dress, Richard finally admitted to himself that he was falling hopelessly in love. The special Saturday lunch had been the most joyous and relaxed meal Richard had experienced in over 3 years. Francis had spent the entire time enthusiastically recounting highly embarrassing stories from Richard's privileged childhood, causing Madeline to giggle uncontrollably, while Richard pretended to be terribly offended by the exposure. As soon as the lavish dessert was entirely consumed, Francis strategically announced that she urgently needed to take a long afternoon nap, leaving the two young people entirely alone in the grand living room. Madeline playfully noted that his mother was not exactly subtle with her romantic matchmaking attempts, and Richard could only laugh in total agreement, secretly grateful for his mother's blatant meddling. They sat comfortably on the plush velvet sofa, sharing a companionable silence as they gazed out the large windows at the blooming spring garden. Madeline softly remarked on how much happier and healthier Francis looked, humbly attributing the miraculous change to the natural passing of time. Richard immediately corrected her, firmly stating that she was the sole reason his mother had finally returned to the land of the living. He gently asked how she had learned to care for people with such profound empathy. Madeline grew quiet, her eyes reflecting deep memories, as she explained that she had learned absolutely everything by watching her resilient mother care for her dying father with absolute devotion and endless respect. Richard felt a powerful surge of emotion tighten in his chest at her deeply touching words. He offered his sincerest condolences for the tragic loss of her father, and Madeline smiled sadly, stating that she honored his memory every single day by treating others with genuine kindness. Unable to contain his overwhelming feelings any longer, Richard softly thanked her for everything she had done, not just for physically caring for his mother, but for bringing true life back into their hollow home and reminding him that genuinely good, selfless people still existed in this chaotic world. Madeline looked at him with shining eyes, entirely speechless at his heartfelt, unexpected declaration. Later that evening, during their new daily routine of Richard driving her back to the busy city, the atmosphere inside the luxurious car was charged with unspoken emotions. As they cruised down the illuminated highway, Madeline hesitantly broke the quiet tension by bravely asking Richard why a handsome, successful man like him had never chosen to get married. Caught entirely off guard by the highly personal question, Richard honestly confessed that he had simply dedicated his entire youth to building his massive business empire, completely neglecting his personal life until he woke up one day entirely alone. He then gently turned the question back to her, asking about her own romantic history. Madeline let out a soft sigh, staring at the passing street lamps, and revealed that she had once been deeply involved in a very serious relationship. However, the moment her former boyfriend discovered that she was merely a humble caregiver without a fancy university degree or a wealthy family background, he had cowardly abandoned her. Richard felt a sudden, fierce flash of anger toward the unknown man, loudly declaring that the guy was an absolute fool. Madeline offered a humorless chuckle, noting that the painful experience had taught her a vital lesson. She only wanted a man who cherished her exactly as she was, without any superficial expectations or financial requirements. Richard pulled the heavy car to a smooth stop right in front of her modest apartment building, putting the engine in park, but making absolutely no move to unlock the heavy doors. He turned to face her entirely in the dim light of the street lamps, his voice dropping to a serious, intense register. He firmly stated that any man who could not see her immense worth was completely blind, and that she was the most incredible woman he had ever met. Madeline stopped breathing for a fraction of a second, completely paralyzed by the raw honesty radiating from his handsome face. He gently reached across the leather console and took her small hand in his. Several days later, Richard purposefully canceled a highly important meeting with international investors just so he could arrive home early in the late afternoon. When he walked through the grand entrance, he heard the faint, beautiful sound of his late father's favorite jazz record echoing softly through the large halls. Following the romantic melody, he found Francis and Madeline actually dancing together in the center of the living room. It was such a profoundly beautiful and healing sight that warm tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. Francis immediately spotted him and joyfully commanded him to come over and take her place, insisting that he dance with their lovely caregiver. Despite his initial awkward protests, Madeline stepped forward and gently offered her hand, her eyes shining with quiet encouragement. Richard pulled her close, terrified of stepping on her feet, but she guided him with incredible, gentle patience. As they swayed slowly to the timeless music, the rest of the massive house completely faded away. He looked deeply into her beautiful eyes, unable to hide his feelings any longer, and softly whispered that he had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with her. Madeline gasped, tears of pure joy spilling over her eyelashes, and whispered that she had loved him since the very first day. He leaned in and kissed her, sealing their beautiful, unspoken promise. In the bright, joyful days following their deeply emotional confession, Richard and Madeline desperately tried to keep their blossoming romance a closely guarded secret. They did not want to complicate the professional dynamics of the household or cause any unnecessary stress, but their powerful chemistry was utterly impossible to hide. They constantly exchanged lingering glances across the formal dining table, shared shy, secret smiles in the long hallways, and found endless excuses to brush against one another. Frances, of course, noticed absolutely everything with immense satisfaction. She constantly invented ridiculous errands, demanding that Richard stay home to help Madeline with simple tasks, purposely leaving the two lovebirds entirely alone. One beautiful Sunday afternoon, the three of them were out in the expansive backyard, working together in the vibrant flower garden that Frances had recently revived. The older woman strategically placed herself on a distant stone bench, pretending to rest, while actually watching her son and the caregiver laugh together over a patch of stubborn weeds. Richard leaned close to Madeline, whispering sweet words that made her cheeks flush a brilliant shade of crimson. They were building a beautiful foundation of mutual respect and genuine friendship that quickly solidified into an unbreakable romantic bond. Richard knew with absolute certainty that this humble, wonderful woman was his ultimate destiny. Later that same week, Richard returned from the corporate office to find Madeline happily humming a cheerful tune while baking a large cake in the gourmet kitchen. After stealing a sweet, flower-dusted kiss, they were suddenly interrupted by Frances, who loudly announced her presence by intentionally stomping her feet. While Madeline giggled and returned to her mixing bowl, Frances pulled her tall son aside, dragging him directly into the formal study. She sat down heavily in a leather chair, her expression instantly turning dead serious. She looked her son right in the eye and strictly commanded him to marry Madeline as soon as humanly possible, completely shocking him with her absolute bluntness. Richard stammered, entirely caught off guard, arguing that they had only been together for a few short months, and that he did not want to overwhelm the poor girl with sudden pressure. But Frances fiercely shook her head, her voice trembling slightly with hidden emotion. She firmly reminded him that life was incredibly fragile and entirely unpredictable. She desperately wanted to witness her only son happily married to a genuinely good woman, and she wanted Madeline officially woven into their family before her own time on earth ran out. Moved by his mother's raw vulnerability, Richard swallowed his lingering fears and solemnly promised that he would ask for Madeline's hand in marriage very soon. That very night, Richard lay awake in his massive, empty bed, carefully plotting the most perfect way to propose to the incredible woman of his dreams. He knew perfectly well that Madeline would absolutely despise a flashy public spectacle at an overpriced restaurant or a grand gesture involving a large crowd. She valued authenticity, quiet moments, and meaningful connections above all else. He decided that the absolute best place to ask her to share his entire life was right there in the peaceful garden they had cultivated together, surrounded by the beautiful flowers she had lovingly planted with his mother. It had to be intimate, genuine, and completely from the heart. When Saturday morning finally arrived, Richard anxiously called Madeline and requested that she come to the grand estate slightly earlier than her usual scheduled time, vaguely claiming he had a special surprise for her. When she walked through the heavy wooden gates, looking incredibly beautiful in a simple sundress, Richard gently took her hand and led her directly to the back gardens. He had set up a small, elegant wooden table right in the center of the blooming roses, decorated simply with fresh wildflowers and a few flickering candles. Frances was already sitting quietly on a nearby bench, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief and smiling through thick tears of absolute joy. Madeline looked around in sheer confusion, her eyes darting between Richard and his highly emotional mother. Richard took a massive, steadying breath and slowly lowered himself down onto one knee, right on the soft green grass. Madeline let out a loud gasp, her hands instantly flying up to cover her mouth in pure shock. Richard spoke with a trembling, emotion-filled voice, recalling the exact day she had walked into their gloomy house as the 11th caregiver, bringing radiant light, boundless love, and genuine hope back into their shattered lives. He told her she was the most incredible woman he had ever known, and that he never wanted to spend a single day without her. He carefully pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and popped it open, revealing a breathtaking, yet elegantly simple diamond ring. He looked up into her tear-filled brown eyes and softly asked if she would do him the supreme honor of becoming his beloved wife. Madeline was crying so incredibly hard that she could not even form a proper word, merely nodding her head vigorously up and down. Finally, she managed to choke out a joyful, definitive yes. Richard slid the beautiful ring onto her trembling finger, stood up, and pulled her into a passionate embrace, while Frances clapped loudly from her bench, loudly declaring that it was about time. In the incredibly happy days following the romantic garden proposal, the newly engaged couple immediately began planning their upcoming wedding. Madeline deeply desired a very small, intimate ceremony, and Richard completely agreed, wanting nothing more than to celebrate their love without the stressful pomp and circumstance of high society expectations. However, Madeline harbored one significant anxiety. She desperately needed to introduce Richard to her fiercely protective mother, Carol, who still lived far away in rural Indiana. She worried constantly that her humble mother might feel terribly out of place or intimidated by Richard's immense wealth, so Richard suggested they drive out to the countryside that very weekend to prove his genuine intentions. Frances stubbornly insisted on joining them for the long road trip, loudly declaring that she absolutely needed to meet the mother of her future daughter-in-law. The three of them drove for several hours out of the bustling city and deep into the quiet, sprawling farmlands of Indiana. They finally arrived at a very modest, white-paneled farmhouse surrounded by a vast vegetable garden. Carol Smith, a hard-working woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and hands weathered from years of heavy labor, stepped out onto the porch. When she saw her precious daughter, she burst into a massive smile, rushing down the wooden steps to pull Madeline into a fierce, suffocating hug. After the tearful family reunion, Madeline nervously introduced Richard and his mother to Carol. The older farm woman looked Richard firmly in the eye, critically evaluating the wealthy city man who had successfully stolen her daughter's heart. Richard politely offered his hand, speaking with profound respect as he swore to protect and cherish Madeline for the rest of his natural life. Carol smiled warmly, satisfied by his unwavering sincerity, and invited them all inside the cozy house for freshly brewed coffee and warm homemade pie. As they sat around the worn wooden kitchen table, Frances and Carol bonded instantly, with Frances promising to treat Madeline like the beloved daughter she never had. A month quickly flew by, in a massive whirlwind of joyful wedding preparations. On the quiet evening right before the big day, Frances gently pulled Madeline into her private bedroom and closed the heavy oak door. With trembling hands, the older woman opened a beautiful antique jewelry box and withdrew a stunning vintage diamond necklace featuring a delicate heart-shaped pendant. Frances explained that the priceless heirloom had been gifted to her on her own wedding day by her late mother-in-law, and she desperately wanted Madeline to wear it as a symbol of true love and complete acceptance into their family. Madeline wept openly, tightly embracing Frances and thanking her for her endless kindness. The morning of the wedding arrived with brilliant sunshine and perfectly clear blue skies. The intimate ceremony was set to take place entirely within the vibrant flower garden of the Winnetka estate, the exact spot where Richard had proposed. Carol had traveled from Indiana and spent the entire morning tenderly brushing her daughter's hair and adjusting the remarkably simple, elegant white gown Madeline had chosen. When Madeline finally stepped out onto the lush grass, wearing the beautiful vintage necklace and holding a bouquet of fresh wildflowers, Richard felt his heart completely stop. She looked absolutely angelic, radiating a pure, humble beauty that outshone any extravagant luxury money could ever buy. Richard stood nervously near the beautiful floral archway, wearing a sharply tailored dark suit, with a small empty chair in the front row, carrying a framed photo of his late father. As Madeline walked slowly down the grassy aisle on her proud mother's arm, the entire world seemed to melt away, until only the two of them remained. The kindly older minister spoke eloquently about the profound power of true love, patience, and unbreakable commitment. When the time came to exchange their sacred vows, Richard promised to love her fiercely through every season of life, and Madeline promised to stand by his side as his faithful partner, completely unfazed by his wealth or status. After being joyfully pronounced husband and wife, they shared a tender, passionate kiss, while their small group of friends and family cheered loudly. The outdoor reception was incredibly warm and relaxed, filled with excellent food, rich laughter, and acoustic guitar music. Frances stood up and tapped her crystal glass, delivering a highly emotional speech that left absolutely no dry eye in the garden. She praised the remarkable young woman who had walked into their cold, grieving home as a simple caregiver, but had miraculously healed their broken hearts, bringing her son back to life and giving her a reason to smile again. She raised her glass, triumphantly declaring that a mother truly always knows. As the magical evening finally drew to a gentle close, Richard and Madeline shared a quiet dance under the twinkling stars, holding each other close, in the very garden that had witnessed their entire love story unfold. Looking back on the incredible journey that had brought them together, the deepest truth of their experience became beautifully clear. True wealth in this world is never measured by the size of a bank account, the grandeur of a mansion, or the prestige of a corporate title, but rather by the genuine compassion we extend to one another in our darkest moments. When we open our hearts to unexpected people, choosing to treat the elderly and the vulnerable with profound respect, patience, and unwavering dignity, we often unlock the greatest blessings life has to offer. Authentic love cannot be purchased or forced. It quietly blossoms in the fertile soil of kindness and sincere empathy. By looking beyond superficial labels and social classes, we discover that the most ordinary acts of care, a listening ear, a gentle touch, a shared meal, hold the miraculous power to heal profound grief and transform entirely broken lives into extraordinary legacies of enduring joy and everlasting companionship.